the Director of Operations at Float, and I just would love to hear more about what Float does, just a little bit of information about your company.
We are a resource management tool, so we help teams plan their time at work. And so our tool basically centralizes your people and projects in your schedule, in a live schedule, and you can assign work based on your team's capacity. And so we have about or more than 4,000 customers using Float, and our team at Float is about 50 people. So we operate across 20 different countries, I think at the moment is the running tally. Yeah, so we're 100% remote, very much have remote working in our DNA. We've been remote for more than 10 years now. So it's a big part of what we do.
Oh, wow. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what your company's values are?
We've actually just recently updated these, so I was happy to see that as one of your questions. So I guess our first one is about striving for great over good enough. So that's for us, we want to hold ourselves to really high standards and to be considered one of the best in our industry. And so that comes down to a lot of experimentation. We're really big on iteration and learning. We don't necessarily strive for perfection, but striving for great over work that might just be considered good enough. And then the other one is about being radically truthful and kind. And this comes down to a lot of the way that we work with each other, our relationships, especially with remote working, where trust is especially important. So for us, we don't shy away from sharing hard truths with each other, but obviously always considering doing that in a kind way and having kindness at the heart of the way that we work with each other. So that for us, we find creates a really strong environment where everyone can kind of speak freely, openly, and do that in a way that's really respectful and honors honesty as well. And the next one is around seeking continuous improvement. And this has been a value that's held strong for us for some years now and was on our previous list of values. And that for us is all about self-improvement. That doesn't necessarily need to be in your role at Float. That's personal self-improvement, and every team member at Float is really big on that, about seeking continuous improvement. And so for that, we consider that requires education, getting advice from your peers, and definitely comes back to that experimentation and kind of a willingness to be wrong sometimes and to learn from our experiences. And then the other one, which isn't probably a surprise given our product, Float, is about respecting one another's time. So we believe that time is our most valuable currency. And so we really honour productive communication. We're really considerate when we're communicating with one another. We really consider the medium for our message. We're big on brevity, editing our messages to one another. And then the last one is own it. So for us, we really embrace autonomy. If we have opportunities to provide solutions, we really lean into them. No one on our team really needs permission to do that. And so for us, or for any startup really, the road ahead isn't always paved. So we definitely have a culture of figuring things out, taking responsibility, and we own the misses and we own the wins as well.
So moving a little bit more into sort of your remote pay strategy, I saw in your LinkedIn that you were behind basically figuring out what the remote pay strategy would be for your company. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided in the first place to create a remote work strategy specifically?
I guess true to our values, it's been an experimental process, something we've definitely modified along the way. And I guess going back more than 10 years when we initially looked to hire those early members of our team, Glenn, our CEO, noted that we had the current pay for an engineer at the time was 3 times our revenue. And so they had to be creative about trying to figure out how they could bring on team members and afford to bring on team members. And for them, that meant to hire outside of New York City, where they'd founded Float. And so that's kind of the history. And then fast forward to kind of more towards 2018 is when we really started to look to benchmark pay and look for sources where we could see in the industry, especially in tech and for engineers, look to things like Glassdoor. We looked at Radford. We looked at a few different sources to find that data. And ultimately in 2021, we landed on the Radford Global Compensation Survey. And the reason why we landed on that one is that we wouldn't necessarily consider ourselves a US organization in that our team is completely global and spread out all over the world. But what we really wanted to do is to figure out a way that we could attract the talent that we would be getting in some of those tech hubs. And so we looked at the pay for a software engineer in Silicon Valley, we were starting to look and see where we could get the best data for that pay. And Radford really nailed that for us because we had the ability to filter pay based on location, based on specialization on roles. And ultimately, that's where we landed, where we figured out a formula to benchmark pay for each role. And that was really inspired by some of our peers. We weren't kind of the first people to do that. If you look at other remote first organizations like Buffer, they had something really similar where they took pay and then had indexing specific to their organization. And so for us, what we did is we took the 50th percentile pay for San Francisco, and then we indexed that. And back in 2021, the way we indexed that was that we would do a calculation to figure out a cost of living for each of our team member. And so, for example, for myself living in Melbourne, we did a calculation to figure out what my cost of living was in comparison to a team member, for example, that was living in London, where we consider them to have a very high cost of living. We factored in things like average house prices. We looked at the cost of rent, a few things to build in this formula and figure out if our team members had a low, medium or high cost of living. This served us okay for 12 months or so, but ultimately we felt that it was doing us a little bit of a disservice where we felt that we wanted to take the stance of same work, same pay. And also we found that that strategy limited us in that if we had a team member that was living in a city that we considered to have a high cost of living, so if I go back to that London example, actually don't think we had anyone in London at the time, but using that as an example, we as a remote organisation strongly encourage people to be able to move around. And if someone was to move from London to a city that had a lower cost of living, would we be reducing their pay? These were the questions that we really started to consider. And they restrict us. They restricted as an organisation strategically with hiring, but they also would restrict our team if that's the way that we were operating. And so we ultimately made the decision to scrap indexing based on a cost of living and decided just to take a really firm stance that we pay 50th percentile San Francisco pay for each role, and we index all of it at 95%. So assuming a high cost of living for everyone at Float, regardless of where they work. And so, yeah, we've taken that stance and we feel really passionate about that regardless of where you're living, if you're doing the same job at Float, you'll be paid the same.
Can you talk a little bit more about what indexing means in this case? You said index at 95%.
We're really big at Float on keeping things simple and trying not to overcomplicate things and making sure that our remuneration strategy can be understood by our team. And so I'm glad that you've asked this question. But basically what we would do is when we took the 50th percentile pay for a role, say it is a software engineer role, we would pay 95% of that average annual pay. And so considering that being if someone was living around Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay area, that they would be getting that high pay. And so that's how the indexing works, is the percentage of that 50th percentile pay.
How did you arrive at the 95%?
We're really big on sustainable growth. We are 100% bootstrapped and profitable, and a big part of Float has been about growing sustainably. And it's come down to really what can we afford to give our team, and also we want to be competing with those major cities and those, I guess, the tech hubs. And so we wanted to be able to attract people that had that opportunity to be hired in those cities, but also we wanted to do better. We wanted to do better than that. And so we've incrementally increased that. So we started at 90%. We've increased that to 95%. We obviously have a goal to increase that to pay the full, regardless of whether or not someone's actually living in that Bay Area.
So if somebody, let's say the San Francisco salary 50th percentile is 100,000, you take that and then you index it at 95%, meaning that they would make 95,000. Exactly. And that's everybody for that role at your company.
Everyone around the world. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, that's super interesting because it sounds like you went from location-based initially and then into this location-agnostic model. You talked a lot about sort of what considerations you took while developing the strategy. Can you talk a little bit about implementation, like what went well during it, and also what needed to be improved?
I guess a big part of it as well is having that transparency along the journey. And for our team, we were very clear and transparent on the way that we were benchmarking pay up until that point. And so there wasn't really any surprises for our team. And I think that that's a really, really important thing with a rollout and changes to anyone's pay. It's, it's essentially people's livelihood. It's really important to them. And so we're so big on trust, and our team being on that journey and understanding why we're making changes. And so when we do implement big changes like this, especially related to something like pay, our team are always looped in on the why. And that's almost more important than the what or how much my pay is changing, because we also have a policy that we never decrease pay at Float. And so as part of this change, no one's pay was decreased. And so ultimately, it was a good news story for everyone, of course, if everyone's getting a pay increase. But really, the biggest learning, and for us, which is always best practice, is why. Why are we doing this? And also, looking at it like an experiment. Everything we do is an experimentation, and the stakes are high when you're talking about people's pay. So a lot of thought went into it, and we shared that with people. We wrote a blog post about it. We share it internally because we want our team to understand why.
No, that's great. Were there any other takeaways from implementing the process? I guess actually, I'm also wondering, how long did the process take you? So you said you tried the location-based salaries for 12 months, and then you decided to move into something else.
I wouldn't consider us a startup now, but with tech, SaaS organizations, we go through a lot of change very quickly. And so for us, we look at our current team and also the talent market, and we review stuff like this constantly. And so we don't necessarily put a strategy in place and set and forget. We look at these every single year. And so the process, like we're looking at it now, we have annual pay reviews. We start to work on that in June every year. And so we're always looking at it. We actually don't ever kind of say that it's done. We don't consider anything to ever really be perfect. That's not really what we want, but it takes months. And something like this particular change took a very long time. And also it has to be a sustainable change, right? It needs to be something that's scalable.
Yeah, definitely. So any other takeaways or best practices you'd like to share around remote pay and setting up strategy?
The strategy in place can actually encourage the behaviors that you want in your organization. And for us, that's really what we see the pay strategy doing. So it's not just the opportunity to take a stance like we did and really go really strong on same job, same pay, but it's also the strategies that you implement also impact your culture, impact the way that people behave, impact the way that people feel valued, impact the way that people feel engaged. And for us, when we have people that potentially only meet with their peers once a year in person, things like knowing that you're on the same page in terms of pay goes a long way with trust building with peers. And so I think for us, it's been different because we've built this strategy from being a remote first organization. We never kind of reverse engineered the remote journey. We were never in office or co-located. But I do think that the pay strategy is really important with trust with your team. And when you're working remotely, if you don't have trust, then it's hard to kind of successfully work, I would say.